London, October 1972. The Royal Court Theatre was buzzing with anticipation. Michael Caine sat in the front row next to director Mike Hodges and producer Michael Caine, waiting for the premiere of Jack Carter. It should have been a celebration. The film that would define Caine's career as a serious dramatic actor. But nothing about this night would go as planned because sitting 3 rows behind them was Laurence Olivier, the greatest actor of his generation, accompanied by his entourage of theatrical royalty. The lights dimmed. The movie began. For the next 112 minutes, the audience watched Michael Caine deliver what would become one of cinema's most iconic performances. Jack Carter, the ruthless London gangster seeking revenge for his brother's death. Raw, brutal, unflinching. This wasn't the charming rogue from The Italian Job or the suave spy from the early Bond films. This was something entirely different. Something dangerous. When the credits rolled, the theater erupted in applause. People stood, cheered, whistled. Caine had just delivered a career-defining performance, and everyone knew it. Everyone except Laurence Olivier. As the applause died down and people began filing out, Olivier's voice cut through the crowd. His trained theatrical voice, designed to reach the back row of any theater, carried clearly across the room. Well, that was certainly interesting. The tone was unmistakable. Condescending. Dismissive. Several people turned to look. Olivier continued, apparently not caring who heard. I suppose this is what passes for serious acting these days. Kitchen sink drama with violence instead of substance. Very contemporary. Michael Caine felt something cold settle in his stomach. He knew that tone. He'd heard it his entire career from classically trained actors who looked down on anyone who hadn't studied at RADA or the Old Vic. But coming from Olivier, the man widely considered Britain's greatest living actor, it stung in a way he wasn't prepared for. Mike Hodges leaned over. Don't listen to him. He's from a different generation. He doesn't understand what we're trying to do. But Caine was already standing up. He turned around to face Olivier, who was now surrounded by his usual crowd of sycophants and fellow classical actors. The theater hadn't fully emptied yet. About 50 people remained, including several journalists who'd covered the premiere. Excuse me, Sir Laurence, Caine said, his voice calm but carrying that unmistakable working-class London accent. Did you want to say something about the film? Olivier looked surprised that anyone would challenge him directly. He was used to making pronouncements that went unchallenged, especially by actors from Caine's background. I was merely commenting on the trajectory of British cinema, Olivier replied smoothly. The movement away from classical storytelling toward what I suppose could charitably be called gritty realism. Gritty realism, Caine repeated. Is that your way of saying you didn't like it? I found it rather common, Olivier said. The word dripping with disdain. Vulgar, actually. All that violence and profanity. Where's the poetry? Where's the nobility of the human spirit that great acting should reveal? The theater had gone completely quiet. This wasn't just a disagreement about a film. This was a clash between 2 different philosophies of acting, 2 different worlds. The classical British theater tradition versus the new wave of naturalistic film acting. Caine felt his jaw tighten. Common, vulgar. These were code words, and everyone in the room knew it. Code words for working class. Code words for someone who hadn't been born into the right family or attended the right schools. You know what, Sir Laurence, Caine said, his voice still calm but with an edge creeping in. I respect your work. Always have. You're a brilliant actor, one of the greatest who ever lived. But you don't know the first thing about me or where I come from. Olivier's eyebrows raised slightly. He wasn't used to being spoken to this way, especially not by someone he clearly considered beneath his station. I grew up in Rotherhithe, Caine continued. South London. My father was a fish market porter. My mother cleaned houses. We lived in a council flat that was so small you could hear everything happening in every room. We had no money, no connections, no advantages. The only thing I had was a desire to act and the willingness to work harder than anyone else. The room was absolutely silent. Several people had stopped putting on their coats to listen. You talk about poetry and nobility in acting, Caine said. But let me tell you something about Jack Carter, that character I just played. He's not noble, he's not poetic, He's a man who came from nothing, who clawed his way up through violence and intimidation because those were the only tools available to him. And when someone hurt his family, he used those same tools to get revenge. Olivier was listening now, his condescending expression replaced by something more attentive. That's not common or vulgar, Caine continued. That's real. That's what life looks like for millions of people who don't have the luxury of nobility, people who can't solve their problems with eloquent speeches or classical training, people who have to use their fists and their wits and their sheer bloody determination to survive. But now Caine was really warming up. This was 20+ years of frustration coming out. 20 years of being looked down upon by the theater establishment, of being told he wasn't good enough for serious roles, of having his accent mocked and his background dismissed. You want to know about acting, Sir Laurence? Real acting isn't about how perfectly you can deliver Shakespeare or how many classical techniques you've mastered. Real acting is about truth. It's about finding something honest in a character and making an audience believe it, whether that character is a king or a criminal. Someone in the crowd actually said "hear, hear" under their breath. Jack Carter isn't Hamlet, Caine said. He doesn't have soliloquies about the nature of existence, but he's just as complex, just as human. He loves his family. He has a code he lives by. He's capable of both tenderness and brutality, sometimes in the same scene. That's not simple. That's not common. That's incredibly difficult to portray truthfully. Olivier seemed to be considering this. The automatic dismissiveness was gone from his expression. But here's what really bothers me about your comment, Caine continued. You dismissed the film as contemporary, like that's somehow lesser than classical. But every generation of actors thinks their approach is the only valid one. When you were starting out, I guarantee you there were older actors who thought your naturalistic style was too modern, too different from the grand theatrical tradition. This hit home. Several people who knew theater history nodded in recognition. Olivier had indeed been criticized early in his career for being too modern, too influenced by film techniques. Acting evolves, Caine said. It has to, because the world evolves. The problems people face evolve. The way they speak evolves. If we only ever told stories about kings and princes, if we only ever used classical language and classical techniques, we'd be irrelevant to most people's lives. He paused, looking directly at Olivier. You've played some incredible roles. Hamlet, Richard III, Henry V, magnificent performances that will be remembered forever. But I guarantee you that Jack Carter will also be remembered, not because he's noble or poetic, but because he's real. Because audiences will recognize something true in him, something that connects to their own struggles and their own capacity for both love and violence. The theater was completely silent. This wasn't just about acting techniques anymore. This was about class, about who gets to tell stories, about whose experiences are considered worthy of serious attention. Olivier stood up slowly. He was a tall man, imposing even in his 70s. For a moment it looked like he might respond angrily, might put this upstart actor back in his place. Instead, he began to clap. It was slow, deliberate applause, but it was genuine. Then others joined in. Within seconds, the entire remaining crowd was applauding, not for the film this time, but for what they'd just witnessed. A working-class actor defending not just his own work, but the entire idea that all experiences, all backgrounds, all ways of speaking and being could be the source of great art. When the applause died down, Olivier stepped forward. "Mr. Caine," he said, his voice quieter now, more personal. "You're absolutely right. I was being a snob, an old fool stuck in old ways of thinking." Caine looked surprised. He'd expected a fight, not an apology. "I watched your performance tonight," Olivier continued, "and I was disturbed by it. Not because it was bad, but because it was so bloody good, so raw and honest and immediate. It made me feel old, frankly. It made me wonder if my way of acting, all that classical training and technique, was becoming obsolete." The crowd was riveted. This was Laurence Olivier, the most revered actor in Britain, admitting doubt about his own methods. "But you've just reminded me of something I'd forgotten," Olivier said. "When I was young, when I was starting out at the Old Vic, there were critics who said exactly the same things about my performances that I just said about yours. They called my acting too modern, too psychological, not classical enough. He smiled, a genuine smile that transformed his entire face. I was so busy defending my territory, so worried about preserving what I thought was the proper way to act, that I forgot the most important thing. Good acting is good acting, regardless of the method or the background or the accent of the person doing it. Caine stood there, not quite knowing what to say. He'd come prepared for a fight and instead found himself in the middle of what felt like a reconciliation. "Your Jack Carter," Olivier continued, "is every bit as valid a character study as any Shakespearean king. More valid, perhaps, because he speaks to the world we actually live in now. I was wrong to dismiss it. Wrong to dismiss you." The theater burst into applause again, this time even louder than before. People were witnessing something extraordinary. Not just an apology, but a meeting of minds across class lines, across generational differences, across competing schools of acting. But then something unexpected happened. A journalist who'd been taking notes throughout the exchange called out from the back, "Sir Laurence, are you saying that method acting is superior to classical training?" It was a trap. A question designed to restart the conflict, to get a quote that would make headlines. Olivier could have taken the bait, could have clarified that he wasn't abandoning his principles, just being polite. Instead, he looked at Caine. "What do you think, Michael? Is one approach superior to the other?" It was a generous move, giving Caine the chance to have the last word, to claim victory if he wanted it. But Caine surprised everyone. "No," he said simply. "They're just different tools for different jobs. You wouldn't use a hammer to fix a watch, and you wouldn't use a screwdriver to build a house. Sir Lawrence's classical training serves him brilliantly in the roles he chooses. My background serves me in the roles I choose. The audience gets to decide if either of us is any good at our job." It was a perfect answer. Diplomatic but firm, respectful but not subservient. It acknowledged Olivier's stature while maintaining Caine's own dignity. "Besides," Caine added with a slight grin, "if we all acted the same way, the cinema would be bloody boring, wouldn't it?" The crowd laughed, and the tension that had built up over the past 20 minutes finally dissipated. What could have been a bitter public feud had turned into something else entirely. A conversation about art, about class, about the evolution of an entire industry. As people began to file out of the theater, many stopped to shake hands with both men. The journalists were scribbling furiously, knowing they'd witnessed something significant. Mike Hodges approached Caine. "That was brilliantly handled. You could have destroyed him if you'd wanted to. Why didn't you?" Caine thought about it. "Because destroying him wouldn't have proved anything except that I could be cruel. What I wanted to prove was that I could act, that my background didn't disqualify me from serious work. I think I did that." Meanwhile, Olivier was having his own conversation with his entourage. One of them, a younger actor from the National Theatre, asked, "Sir Laurence, do you really think his approach is as valid as yours?" Olivier considered the question seriously. Validity isn't the right word. What matters is effectiveness. Did his performance in Get Carter serve the story? Did it move the audience? Did it reveal something true about the character and by extension about the human condition? He paused. The answer to all those questions is yes. Absolutely yes. So how can I argue with the results? Over the following weeks, the story of the confrontation spread throughout London's entertainment circles. But unlike similar incidents, this one didn't create lasting animosity. Instead, it seemed to open a dialogue about different approaches to acting that had been long overdue. Olivier began watching more contemporary films, studying the work of actors like Caine, Albert Finney, and Tom Courtenay. He started to appreciate the naturalistic style he'd initially dismissed, even incorporating some of its techniques into his own later performances. Caine, meanwhile, found himself with a new level of respect in serious acting circles. The fact that he'd stood up to Olivier without being disrespectful, that he'd defended his craft without attacking classical training, impressed many who had previously dismissed him as just another movie star. 6 months later, they worked together on a film called Sleuth, directed by Joseph L. Mankiewicz. It was a two-man psychological thriller that required both actors to bring their absolute best. The result was extraordinary. Olivier's classical precision and Caine's naturalistic immediacy played off each other perfectly, creating a tension that elevated both performances. During filming, they became friends. Not close friends perhaps, but genuine mutual admirers. Olivier appreciated Caine's work ethic and his refusal to be intimidated by reputation. Caine valued Olivier's craftsmanship and his willingness to learn from actors half his age. Years later, in interviews, both men would cite Sleuth as one of their favorite acting experiences, not because it was easy, but because it challenged them to step outside their comfort zones and learn from each other. When Olivier died in 1989, Caine was one of the speakers at his memorial service. He talked about their first meeting at the Get Carter premiere, about how a potentially destructive confrontation had turned into a learning experience for both of them. "Larry taught me that greatness in acting isn't about where you come from or how you were trained," Caine said. "It's about honesty, about commitment to the truth of the character, about serving the story rather than your own ego. He also taught me that you're never too old to learn, never too accomplished to grow." He paused, looking out at the crowd of Britain's greatest actors and directors. "But most importantly, he taught me that respect isn't something you demand, it's something you earn by respecting others." That night in 1972, he could have destroyed me with a few cutting remarks. Instead, he chose to listen, to consider what I was saying, to acknowledge when he was wrong. That's not just good acting, that's good character. The memorial service was held at Westminster Abbey, with all the pomp and ceremony befitting Britain's greatest actor. But those who were there said the most moving moment was when Michael Caine, the working-class kid from South London, paid tribute to Sir Laurence Olivier, the aristocrat of British theatre, and reminded everyone that great art comes from great humanity, regardless of background or training. That night at the Royal Court Theatre in 1972 became legendary in British entertainment circles, not as a story of conflict, but as a story of understanding. Two men from different worlds with different approaches to their craft, finding common ground in their shared love of acting and their mutual respect for honest work. The immediate aftermath of the confrontation was equally remarkable. As the theater finally emptied, several prominent critics approached both men. Kenneth Tynan, the influential theater critic for The Observer, had witnessed the entire exchange. "Mr. Caine," Tynan said, "I've been covering theater for 20 years and I've never seen anything quite like that. You articulated something that needed to be said about the democratization of British acting." Caine was still processing what had happened. "I wasn't trying to make a political statement. I was just defending my work." "That's exactly what made it so powerful," Tynan replied. "You spoke from personal experience, not from ideology. That's why it resonated." Meanwhile, Olivier was having his own revelations. As he walked to his car with his wife Joan Plowright, she said something that stuck with him for years. "Larry, I'm proud of you tonight. Not for your career or your knighthood, but for having the grace to admit when you were wrong. That took real courage." Olivier stopped walking. "Did I make a fool of myself, backing down like that?" "You didn't back down," Joan said firmly. "You evolved, right there in front of 50 people. That's not weakness. That's wisdom." The next morning, the story was in all the papers. But the coverage wasn't what either man expected. Instead of focusing on the conflict, most journalists wrote about the resolution, about two generations of actors finding mutual respect, about the changing face of British cinema. The Daily Telegraph's headline read, "When Titans meet, Olivier and Caine find common ground." The Guardian focused on the class implications. Working-class hero earns theatrical knight's respect. But it was Harold Hobson's review in the Sunday Times that captured the real significance. "Last night at the Royal Court, we witnessed more than a film premiere. We saw the moment when British acting grew up, when the artificial barriers between legitimate theater and commercial cinema finally crumbled." Within weeks, the incident had transformed both men's careers in unexpected ways. Caine found himself being offered more substantial dramatic roles. Directors who had previously seen him only as a commercial actor began to take him seriously as a craftsman. Peter Hall, director of the National Theatre, called Caine's agent within a month. "I've got a production of The Caretakers coming up. Tell Michael I think he'd be perfect for Mick." It was exactly the kind of serious theatrical role that Caine had been denied for years. Harold Pinter's working-class characters were suddenly seen as a natural fit for an actor who'd been dismissed as too commercial. Olivier, meanwhile, began exploring contemporary cinema with new eyes. He started watching films by directors like Ken Loach and Mike Leigh, appreciating the social realism he'd once dismissed. He even agreed to appear in a television drama about unemployment in the north of England, playing against type as a redundant factory worker. The collaboration on Sleuth came about directly because of that night. Joseph L. Mankiewicz had been in the audience at the royal court. He'd been considering different actors for the two-man thriller, but witnessing the dynamic between Olivier and Caine convinced him they'd be perfect together. "I saw something that night that you can't manufacture," Mankiewicz later said. Two actors who respected each other's craft but approached it completely differently. That tension, that mutual admiration, that's exactly what Sleuth needed. The filming of Sleuth became its own legend. Olivier, famous for his meticulous preparation, was fascinated by Caine's more intuitive approach. Caine would arrive on set, read through the scene once, and be ready to film. Olivier would spend hours analyzing every line, every motivation. "Michael taught me something valuable," Olivier said years later. "Sometimes overthinking can kill spontaneity." There's a freshness to his approach that I'd lost somewhere along the way. Caine, meanwhile, learned from Olivier's technical precision. "Larry showed me that you could be natural and still be incredibly disciplined." His preparation was like a master craftsman building a watch. Every piece had to be perfect. Their scenes together crackled with energy. The age difference, the class difference, the different approaches to acting, all of it fed into their characters' relationship. Critics called it one of the best acting duels ever captured on film. But beyond the professional impact, the friendship that developed between them became genuinely meaningful to both men. They'd meet for dinner occasionally. Usually at Olivier's club in St. James's, the conversations ranged from technique to politics to their very different childhoods. "You know what fascinates me about you, Michael?" Olivier said during one of these dinners. "You never apologize for who you are. I spent my entire early career trying to disguise my middle-class origins, trying to sound more posh than I actually was. You embrace your background. Use it as a strength." "Had to," Caine replied. "Couldn't change it anyway. Might as well make it work for me instead of against me." These conversations began to influence Olivier's later performances. His final roles showed a new kind of vulnerability, a willingness to let his own humanity show through rather than hiding behind classical technique. The ripple effects of that night continued for years. Other working-class actors began to find more acceptance in serious dramatic roles. Albert Finney, Tom Courtenay, Bob Hoskins, all of them benefited from the barrier that Caine had helped to break down. Drama schools began to change their approach too. Instead of trying to train out regional accents, they started to value authenticity. The idea that there was only one correct way to speak on stage or screen began to fade. When the British Academy of Film and Television Arts honored both men with fellowships in 1985, they presented the awards together. Caine spoke first, talking about the importance of the BAFTA organization in supporting British talent regardless of background. Then Olivier took the podium. 13 years ago, he said, "I nearly made one of the biggest mistakes of my career. I nearly dismissed someone whose talent I was too narrow-minded to recognize. Michael Caine taught me that night that great acting isn't about where you went to school or how you learned your craft. It's about honesty, commitment, and the courage to be yourself." He paused, looking directly at Caine. "Michael, you've honored our profession not by changing to fit it, but by being so authentically yourself that the profession had to expand to accommodate you. That's true artistry." The standing ovation that followed lasted nearly 5 minutes. In the audience were actors from every background, every generation, every approach to the craft. They were applauding not just two great performers, but the idea that excellence comes in many forms. The story took on mythical proportions in acting schools and green rooms across Britain. Young actors facing rejection or class-based discrimination would remind each other of the night Michael Caine stood up to Laurence Olivier and earned his respect through sheer force of character. But perhaps the most telling moment came much later, at Olivier's 80th birthday party in 1987. The great and good of British theatre and cinema were there. Gielgud, Richardson, Redgrave, Dench. When it came time for toasts, Olivier asked specifically for Caine to speak. Caine raised his glass and said, "To Larry Olivier, who taught me that the mark of a truly great man isn't that he's never wrong, but that he has the grace to change his mind when he is. And who showed me that respect isn't about agreement. It's about recognizing quality wherever you find it. As the party continued, young actors approached both men throughout the evening. They wanted to hear about technique, about career choices, about surviving in a tough industry, but more than anything, they wanted to hear about that night in 1972. "The thing people don't understand," Caine would tell them, "is that I wasn't trying to humiliate him. I was trying to explain something that mattered to me, and he was big enough to listen. That's what made him great. Not just his talent, but his character." If you've ever felt judged for your background, your accent, or your approach to your passion, Michael Caine's response to Laurence Olivier reminds us that excellence speaks louder than pedigree, that standing up for yourself doesn't require tearing others down. That respect, once earned through honest work and genuine character, transcends all barriers of class, education, and tradition. More than that, it shows us that even our heroes are human, capable of growth and change. That wisdom lies not in never being wrong, but in having the courage to admit when you are, and the grace to do better. In a world that often seems divided by background and circumstance, the story of Michael Caine and Laurence Olivier reminds us that mutual respect and understanding are always possible when people of good faith are willing to listen to each other.